This is a recording with Ken Mansell. We're doing it by Zoom. I'm Barry York. Ken and I have both had a lot of experience in the field of oral history. I'll treat it like an interview to an extent, but let's make it conversational where we both can share experience. To begin at the beginning, when did you first become aware of oral history?
Well, I have no doubt that it was to do with the work of Wendy Lowenstein. You're probably aware yourself that Wendy's regarded by many as the pioneer of oral history in Australia. I had quite a bit to do with Wendy in the 60s, starting as early as probably 1964. One of my songs was published in her folk music magazine Tradition. The song was The Voyager, which I wrote in January 1964, pretty soon after the actual disaster where the Voyager, an Australian naval warship, crashed into the Melbourne, or was it the other way around? They crashed together in Jervis Bay in New South Wales. Wendy was very keen to encourage me in songwriting, and over the subsequent 2 or 3 years, I visited her on a number of occasions, mainly to talk about my songs, probably to encourage her to publish more than what she already had, actually. But we got to know each other. I was aware then, and I'm talking probably sort of about the late 60s and early 70s, I was aware that she was engaged in field trips. And a lot of those field trips which she conducted were documented in Tradition magazine. I have an almost complete collection of Tradition magazine, by the way, so it would be possible probably by looking back through those copies of Tradition to document her field trip activity. I suspect that she was probably, and I don't have any evidence for this off the top of my head, but I suspect she was probably influenced by Studs Terkel, the American broadcaster who had a radio program in Chicago and probably was the pioneer in the English-speaking world of oral history and its broadcast. He would interview people and then broadcast the interviews on his radio program in Chicago. And over a number of years, he published quite a lot of books. His book, which was an oral history of the Great Depression, was published in 1970. Now, that probably had some influence on Wendy in that, insofar as 8 years later, she published Weevils in the Flower, which was her own oral history of the Great Depression in Australia. I don't see how she could not have been influenced by Studs Terkel. Actually, I think I can remember her talking about Studs Terkel. Actually, on a number of times when I visited her house in Westbourne Street, Prahran, she drew my attention to her tape collection. I vaguely remember actually seeing her tape collection, because at that time, of course, she wouldn't have donated them to the National Library, as she eventually did, and to the State Library of Victoria, as she eventually did. So she had them in her lounge room. That's my vague memory. I think that'd be pretty right, because it was a very small, single-fronted weatherboard house, a bit run down. Wendy used to talk about how she and Werner, her husband, would never leave Westbourne Street, even though they were surrounded by plastic people. She was referring to I suppose, the middle-class trendies that had begun to populate Armidale and Prahran. She would never leave Westbourne Street. She was sticking with this house until she dropped. But she was a character, and I could probably give you a whole interview about Wendy Lowenstein, but she was definitely the pioneer of oral history in Australia. Now, at the time that I'm describing, which was the 60s and up to mid-70s, there wouldn't have been any other practitioners. There probably wasn't anything like an oral history association. She and Werner were going on field trips in their car, taking the 2 children with them. One of the, Marty and Richard Lowenstein, of course, eventually to become famous as a filmmaker. Yep. And Marty is a very solid supporter of her mother's oral history collection too, and has done a lot of work on that collection. They would take the car and they'd travel all over Australia basically, and they weren't specifically looking for folk songs or folklore, although I suspect that was part of Wendy's motivation, but they collected an enormous amount of material, and what they were looking for was the common person. Wendy would have subscribed. In fact, I know she subscribed to the idea that common folk had been hidden from history, because academic history in particular had always been influenced by the ruling class outlook that what mattered most were the activities of the important people, the rich and the famous, the kings, queens, princesses, lords, ladies. And, you know, in fact, social history was probably a latecomer in academic history, because, you know, the standard 19th century history, particularly in England, would have probably focused mainly on the activities of the aristocracy and the bourgeoisie. So social history was a latecomer, and then eventually oral history was to become a part of social history, documenting the activity and through the memories and stories of ordinary people. So just on Wendy, we're talking about Weevils in the Flower. Weevils in the Flower was, before I go on with Weevils in the Flower and the influence that had on me, I've just been doing a little bit of digging around on the internet to try to discover the association between oral history as we know it, or as we have known it since, say, the 1970s, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the activity of collectors of folklore and folk music in the late 19th and early 20th century. In some ways, the collection of folklore and folk music and folk song was the forerunner of the oral history movement, because collectors like Cecil Sharp in England, Francis Child and Maud Capel's, Percy Granger, the Australian, they saw their role as collecting the culture and memories of ordinary people, not specifically or only folk songs, but they saw their role as collecting the hidden history, or the history that had been hidden up to that point. I was just doing a bit of digging around on Cecil Sharp, the great but controversial collector of English folk song, who later travelled to America and collected the folk music of the Appalachian Mountains, which previously hadn't even been known. Just to divert it for a second, because the Appalachian people were hidden away in the hills, treated as hillbillies, as non-entities, their wonderful, rich musical inheritance that they had brought over with them, or their descendants had brought over, sorry, not their descendants, their antecedents had brought over from the British Isles, was not known in the, you know, say New York or in the north of, you know, in the capital cities of America. But what I was trying to trace here was the way that the collectors of folklore in that period actually recorded the folklore and the folk song. And it would appear that Sharp himself did, to a certain extent, but didn't feel comfortable with it, because he had this idea that the mechanical device would intimidate or distract the interviewee or the singer. He preferred to do his own notation. He must have been very quick with his notation to take down something like 2,000 songs over the period that he did this. But later on, Percy Granger, the Australian eccentric but great composer of classical music influenced by folk music, he used the phonograph, which had originally been invented by Thomas Edison, the American inventor. And I believe there was something like a phonograph cylinder that they recorded sound on, and they could play it back. So there's probably the very early version of the tape recorder.
Yeah, yeah.
The tape recorder that we only became familiar. Yeah.
So it was Wendy Lowenstein, really, who made you, when you were first aware of oral history.
I'll just throw something in here, which is probably not of great significance, but it's an early memory. I can remember my Uncle Norm coming back from Europe sometime in about the mid-50s and bringing with him this strange machine, which he delightedly exhibited to the family gathering on one occasion. It was a tape recorder, and he recorded Barry Humphries. It must have been late 50s, I think, because Barry Humphries wouldn't have been known. Or maybe it was the music played this recording of Barry Humphries. And this sound, this voice coming out of this machine. You can imagine, so that was my earliest association with a tape recorder. Getting back to Wendy Lowenstein and Weevils in the Flower. Weevils in the Flower was published in 1978. And it was awe-inspiring, really, that she'd gone to all that trouble. It must have taken her years and years and years. First of all, she had to collect the material. Then she had to edit it, assemble it in some sort of logical editorial order, and then find a publisher. And I think the hardback came out, the publisher was Highland House, from memory. But that was 1978. And initially, I don't think it had so much of an impact, but eventually it did. And as you probably know yourself, Barry, it was later became part of the high school curriculum, certainly in Victoria, where history teachers would sort of introduce their students to not just oral history, but to the Great Depression. And it became almost a standard work on the Depression, later challenged by a certain individual at La Trobe University called David Potts, who believed that Wendy was romanticising the Depression. He believed that it wasn't nearly as bad as what Wendy was making it out to be. But she had a large number of ordinary people, but for those of us who are already familiar with the communist movement in Australia, she had a lot of the old-time communists, people like Noel Kernahan. I'm trying to think of the bloke who did the stump oratory in Port Melbourne. Jim Cool, Wharfies. Later on, she produced, of course, an oral history of the Wharfies, the WWF, the Melbourne Docks in particular. She teamed up with Morag Lowe to produce a book on an oral history of immigration, which I'm sure you're familiar with.
Yes.
So Wendy was definitely the first person to introduce me to the practice of oral history and the idea of oral history. Now, I was at this time that when Weevils in the Flower was being sold, and after I bought a copy, I was at Swinburne completing my Bachelor of Arts in history and, well, not actually in history, in sociology and modern government. Unfortunately, I didn't have an academic training in history or history writing, and that was to have its consequences later on, as I might eventually mention. But I was finishing off my BA, and I was doing a unit with Kelvin Rowley, who was one of the student radicals of the 60s, who'd written a lot for Arena magazine, was very involved at Melbourne University and in particular the Melbourne University Labour Club, was prolific in his writing. For us, or for some of us anyway, he was an intellectual giant. He was running the course, and it was a combined kind, it was sort of like an economic history course. And I managed to persuade him to let me do an essay on the Communist Party, because I'd just seen this film called Menace, which had been produced by John Hughes, a left-wing filmmaker in Melbourne. And I think Menace came out in sometime early 1979, and it showed the Cold War hysteria against the Australian Communist Party. And it had interviews with, people like Dorothy Gibson and Joan Goodwin and the Coonahans. Also actually had Mick Coonahan in it at one point, I think, the film. And Sandra Zerbo, I think, was actually in it as well. And I've got a copy of it, but that's irrelevant here. But I think I wanted to kind of do my little bit to document the Cold War in Melbourne. So I lined up Wendy for an interview, and she brought along a woman called Jill, whose surname I don't think I ever got to actually know, because I've got a note somewhere that it's Wendy and Jill, but Jill who, I'm not sure, or I have no way of knowing now. Anyway, I interviewed Jill and Wendy for about 2 hours. I got quite a lot of really, and I've still got that interview, and they were talking about the Eureka Youth League, being in the EYL in the late 40s and taking food and vegetables down to the striking miners in Wonthaggi during the coal strike, the national coal strike. A lot of good stuff like that. I found that a really enjoyable experience. But actually, it wasn't my first oral history interview. It was only my second. The first oral history interview I ever did, in fact, was done with my clunky old national reel-to-reel tape recorder in June 1969 in Greville Street, Prahran, with an old cobbler, bootmaker called Bill Jennery, who'd been in the Wobblies, the IWW in Australia or in Melbourne, in World War I, or around the time of World War I. He was in it, I think he was a member for about 4 or 5 years. And that interview is now on the National Library, or accessible on the National Library of Australia website. I was introduced to Bill Jennery by Jill Jolliffe, who, along with Ron Lawson, her partner, owned the Alice's Restaurant Bookshop 2 doors down from the bakery being the headquarters for about 2 years of the Monash Labour Club. And in 1969, in 1969, it was also the headquarters of the Revolutionary Socialist Alliance, before the Revolutionary Socialist Alliance was transformed into the Worker Student Alliance. So I did my interview with Bill Jennery, and I won't go into detail about that here, but that was an important interview because in 1969, there wouldn't have been too many former Wobblies still around. He had a very vivid recall of his experiences in the IWW. He knew a lot of the key activists in the Wobblies at the time. He even knew Monty Miller, who was active at Eureka. He described, his friendship with Monty Miller. Can you imagine me sitting there with completely awestruck?
Yeah.
Not only did he have a great recall of the events of the time around World War I, but he just started singing all these Wobbly songs. He didn't even have to look at a book or look at notes. I actually took with me the Little Red Songbook of the IWW with me to jog his memory, but he didn't need it. He was just singing them. And this was a month after the great national general strike, which followed upon the jailing of Clary O'Shea of the Tramways Union over the penal powers. And Bill had written a song about Clary O'Shea. So I got it on tape virtually in the month that it was written or composed. Okay. So that was wonderful. So I could talk more about Bill, but so that was my real first interview. It was on reel-to-reel tape. And
it's clear
it's
clear that your reaction to oral history was a very positive one. Am I right to think that?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. Oh, definitely. And it's strange, really, in a way, that I didn't do any more of that sort of thing for another 10 years, basically. So 1979 was the interview with Wendy and Jill. Now, something else happened just after that, which was also very influential. That was the conference that was held in Melbourne called the Communists and Labour Movement Conference, organised by the Communist Party, essentially. And what they'd done was to round up about 100 former members, and maybe quite a lot of present or members who were still members. And they divided, it was held over 3 or 4 days at Melbourne Uni, I think, Melbourne Uni. And there were sessions, probably about 60 or 70 sessions altogether, and they recorded it. And because I was aware that it had been recorded, I was on the lookout for when the tapes would become available. And eventually the recordings of the conference became available at the State Library in Melbourne. And I spent weeks going in there virtually every day, ordering a particular tape or tapes and listening to them, just to go over, hear them again, because obviously one couldn't attend all the sessions. So I wanted to hear the sessions that I hadn't been able to attend, because they had sessions running concurrently. So that alerted me, I think, to the richness of people's memory, and I compared the wonderful memories that were on show at that conference to hear with the dry as bone, purely factual history of the Communist Party that had been written by Alistair Davidson around 1969, or he must have started writing it about 67, but he finished it in 69. I was extremely critical of Davidson's book from a number of points of view, mainly because it concentrated on the leadership aspect rather than the activities of the rank and file. But I had historiographical and methodological differences with it, and it started me on my own trajectory of trying to uncover the social history of the Communist Party, and I started doing research into the Workers' Weekly at the State Library. I started about 1930, and I started doing that, and I continued on for a while, but I got caught up in some sectariana in my Trotskyist group, and had to put it down, had to put the project down. But I retained an interest in trying to go back over the history of the Communist Party and do my own, write my own history of the Communist Party. And so when I started at La Trobe Uni in 1980, albeit without any background in the writing of history, because they managed to, the La Trobe Uni History Department, for some reason, allowed me to start an honours year without having actually done history for my BA at Swinburne. I actually, for my honours history year, I chose to do a history of the Communist Party, but not a social history so much as an intellectual or an ideological history of the kind of an intellectual history of the Communist Party, its ideas, its strategies. And I got a first class honours and topped the year for writing that. And that BA honours thesis on the CPA is actually now on the Labour History website, although you might have to hunt around to find it. Then I started an MA. Foolishly allowed my supervisor to persuade me to convert from the MA to the PhD almost immediately after I started the MA. It was a mistake to follow his advice, because I wasn't, as I said, I hadn't been trained in history writing. I could do the research okay. I was a pretty good researcher then, and I'm a pretty good researcher now, but my skills of organising the material I collect, that I researched and collected was haphazard at best, atrocious at worst. When I was doing my honours year, I locked myself away literally from the world for about 4 or 5 months. I didn't see another human soul for 5 months. I was in a flat in Collingwood, and I had bits of paper in piles strewn all over the lounge room floor. You couldn't walk around the lounge room because there were bits of paper just piled up everywhere. I managed eventually to get through them all, but that was my method. No card system, which was probably the standard way of a lot of academics in those days, because this was pre-computers, you see. You couldn't just set up a Word document or a computer file. You had to use a card system. I just couldn't get the hang of the card system, so I thought I'll just use my traditional method, piling up bits of paper.
Did you do any oral history for your honours thesis?
No, I did one interview with Doug White, who you'd know well.
Yep.
At the Trade Uni, mainly because I wanted to ask him about the Arena thesis and Arena's influence on the Communist Party. So, if I could jump forward a bit, I hope I'm being not too wordy. I'll keep going because we can always do another session.
Definitely. Right? Yeah.
So, in 1981, I started out on my PhD, and I decided to include oral history. I started almost immediately collecting oral history, and over the course of the next 3 years, I did about 100 interviews with people who were members of the Communist Party in the 40s and 50s. Some had already been members in the 30s, just for example, Jim Munro, who finished up being the State Secretary of the Liquor Trades Union, he was a member of the unemployed workers movement in the early Depression years, probably a member of the militant minority as well, the militant minority movement. So there were people who were around in the early 30s, but essentially I was covering and looking at the 40s and 50s, which was what my thesis topic was about. It's a long story, but I didn't complete the PhD for a number of reasons, partly due to my poor methodology. Secondly, also, I had to make a choice between continuing to be active in the nuclear disarmament movement or continue on with my PhD as main priority. In the end, I chose to continue my activity in the nuclear disarmament movement. When People for Nuclear Disarmament was formed at the end of 1981, I was there on the ground floor, so to speak. I was at the very first meeting amongst the people who decided to form PND. I was there the night they decided to form PND. This was people like Joe Camilleri and Sam Goldbloom, you know, the heavies, as it were, of the peace movement as it existed then, Pax Christi, CICD. I chose to adopt a left-wing position to the left of the leadership. And when the first Palm Sunday rally was held in April 1982, I distributed a leaflet I'd written calling upon the peace movement and the people of Melbourne to make opposition to American bases on Australian soil the main plank of the P&D program. And not long after that, I organised or initiated a demonstration at the Omega base in Gippsland. So why I'm recounting those experiences with the anti-bases movement is that I continued on with that activism right through to 1988, until the end of 1988, a good 5 or 6 years. I was freaked out by what Reagan was saying, what Caspar Weinberger was saying at the end of 1979 or 1980. I went through this sort of crisis where I thought, well, you know, I can't stop being involved in this anti-nuclear stuff because I just feel a personal threat. I feel that I've got to do it, you know, commit myself to the issue, and I did. But it meant that I was not putting the time into the thesis, even though I was continuing on with the oral history. You know, what I was doing, in fact, was continuing on with the oral history, but not the historical research. I did a lot of historical research. One day I might be able to use it. So there's a bit of a sad story there, but I feel proud of what I did to contribute, along with millions of others, to make the world a safer place from nuclear war.
So when did you, the current type of research that you've been doing about the Vietnam period, when did that begin? Where does that fit in with, we're up to the late 80s. Did you begin that?
I started I did a master's at Melbourne Uni starting in 1991, right?
Mm-hmm.
A master. See, I didn't. All I had when I started at Melbourne Uni in 1991, all I had was a BA honours degree because I didn't get an MA at the time. So I had a BA honours. So I wanted to get an MA as a first step. So with Stuart McIntyre as my supervisor, I started an MA. Actually, that's not true. It wasn't Stuart McIntyre. It was, no, I did it through the Australian Centre at Melbourne Uni with David Goodman as my supervisor.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
And I was working part-time. I was teaching at Kings Park Secondary College in the western suburbs of Melbourne from 1989 through to 1992. So I was working full-time and studying part-time, but I managed to get my MA while working full-time. It was a bit of a slog. So what I did for my MA was coursework, and I did a thesis, which was a minor thesis really, but it turned out to be a major thesis in many respects, in that it was path-breaking in some respects. It was The Yeast is Red, which you are familiar with. Yeah, The Yeast is Red. Now, I did use oral history for The Yeast is Red. The Yeast is Red was completed at the very beginning of 1994. took me 2 or 3 years to do because I was doing coursework as well. I'd interviewed, by the time I finished The East is Red, I'd probably conducted already about 20 or 30 interviews. And I used about a dozen of those interviews in the actual The East is Red. But what I meant by saying that it was path-breaking or unusual as a thesis or as a piece of history writing was that I actually featured an oral history interview with myself. Now, let me explain. What I had was simulated diary entries scattered throughout the thesis, The East is Red, where, for instance, I would, because I lived at the bakery, you see, so I had direct first-hand experience of what it was like to live there, what it felt like to live there. I had the memories of the everyday, the immediacy of the surroundings, the everyday occurrences that would otherwise be completely lost to history, in that if you're relying only on leaflets, letters, newspaper accounts, newspaper cuttings, etc., you're getting part of the story. In fact, you might even have almost the whole story, but you haven't got the whole story. And I felt that one of the reasons I chose the bakery as my topic was I was sitting in my office at Kings Park one day and it just suddenly hit me, by God, it's the perfect topic. The bakery, I live there. Not only have I got all the leaflets as they came off the cassette machine, but I've also got all the memories inside my head. You know, this is perfect. So I decided to sort of use these memories as a sort of a simulated diary where I'd sort of say, oh, I was walking up the circular staircase of the bakery today and I noticed there was some leaflets on the kitchen table which had been left there by the Sid kids. They're having their meeting downstairs. There's a lot of noise down there because Albert Langer and Julian Shaw are arguing about the merits of the Vanguard Party as against the anarchist theory put forward, which Julian accepts, of Daniel Cohn-Bendit. And so I kind of...
Sid was students in dissent, is that right?
Students in dissent.
Yep.
So I realised that, so I knew that I thought actually that my history supervisor and the history department would frown upon this because, well, partly for all the reasons that academic historians have always rejected oral history because it's subjective. I mean, how was the reader to know that I wasn't making this up? You know, I mean, I had this little bit in there where at the Left Action Conference in 1969, after the conference had finished, a lot of us went down to the pub in Sussex Street, and Mavis Robinson was sitting there with her jug of beer, and Jeff Hogg and I were sitting there, and Jeff and I got to know each other a little bit because I drove him up from Melbourne to Sydney for the conference, and he made some remark about how wonderful Enver Hoxha was. And she dropped her bloody beer. She could not believe what she was. And I won't tell you which side I was on. I think you can guess, can't you? Anyway.
It is a good example, though, of things like that do capture the subjective dimension.
Exactly.
It adds a layer of depth to the understanding of what happened.
Yeah, of course. And the sort of, by adding all those things into the thesis, like for instance, when Adrian Desailly and I were arrested, painting up one night and finished up in Pentridge, for about, for a day. None of that. There's one or two leaflets that record that, but they don't record what it was like getting arrested or, what happened to us, or there's no mention of, anyway, I'm just, what I'm trying to say, that the oral history fills gaps, and I'll read you a quote I have here from Paul Thompson's book, The Voice of the Past. Are you familiar with that book?
Yes.
He says, in the most general sense, once the life experience of people of all kinds can be used as its raw material, a new dimension is given to history. Oral history provides a source quite similar in a character to published autobiography, but much wider in scope. Oral history is a history built around people. It thrusts life into history itself and it widens its scope. The tape recorder not only allows history to be taken down in spoken words, but also to be presented through them. The use of a human voice, fresh, personal, particular, always brings the past into the present with extraordinary immediacy. The words may be idiosyncratically phrased, but all the more expressive for that. They breathe life into history. Now, while we're on that topic of what advantages can be gained by using oral history, I'm sure you're familiar with the fact that one of the original criticisms by academic historians against the use of oral history, certainly in university history departments, was that it's subjective. It represents a subjective view as distinct from the so-called or presumed objective nature of the documentary written or printed source. So the printed source was always regarded as being authoritative, whereas the memory of a person was subject to doubt because of the propensity of the human memory to either fade or alter the reality of the past or romanticise the past. I was always very aware of that as a precautionary principle. I knew that one had to be very cautious in the use of my interviews and the material, because how can you be absolutely sure or sure at all that the person isn't at least a little bit either consciously or deliberately or non-deliberately making it up? So for me, as a general principle, the printed source or the documented source is primary and the oral memory is secondary. I'm not saying that the oral memory isn't important. It is very important if used properly, but it must be regarded as secondary because you can't dispute what is in a written or printed document. It might be factually wrong about what it's talking about, but the fact that it's being, the fact that it's actually talking is a fact which can't be disputed. You see what I'm saying? Whereas the oral memory is subject to verification. And the way you verify it is by checking it, comparing it against as many documented facts as you can possibly lay your hands on. When I was interviewing, I wrote a book. I've got a book here in front of me. I'll show you the cover. Wizards of the Wheel. It's a 400-page oral history of cycling in the years from 1945 to 1965. I did 100 interviews. I asked the question in the introduction, how do I know that John Smith, the cyclist, isn't making things up? Well, I say in the introduction to this book that the way you verify the memory is to check it against as many of the facts as you possibly can. But what motivated me to do this book was I always had an interest in sport history and cycling in particular, and no one else had done it before. Decided to do it, and I did an oral history.
Just on that point about how do you verify what people have said in an oral history interview, a criteria that I applied was that if 3 unrelated interviewees said the same basic thing, I would accept it. And, you know, there are some examples in my work of where that I did that. But also, I mean, a benefit of oral history, of course, is that it can provide leads into the print-based sources. Like somebody will refer to something that isn't already in a print-based source, and they refer to it, and you can then pursue it and see whether it's... I found that very useful with my work. And also, I'll just make a point about the what you said about interviewing yourself, so to speak. I did something like that in 1992. I interviewed Fergus Robinson and Brian Polar. I felt that 20 years on, it was worthwhile recording their memories of the Pentridge jail experience when the three of us ended up in Pentridge for a period of, Fergus did 4 months, Brian Poller did 3 months, and I did 44 days. And you know about that Latrobe jailing in 1972. But just regarding you interviewing yourself, I interviewed Fergus and Brian 20 years after the jailings for their. We focused really only on the experience of what was it like being a political prisoner in Pentridge. And I thought, well, I just had very detailed and clear memories and reflections in 1992 on that experience. And I ended up doing a monologue. I recorded myself, literally, and I followed the question guide that I'd used with Brian and Fergus. And mine was about 2 hours in length. And I'm so glad I did it, Ken, because in 1992, I had better memory, better recollection, more accurate recollection than I would have today, you know.
Well, 20 years was kind of about the same length when I did my interview with myself for the East is Red, about 20 years. And the memories were still vivid. Yeah, so I got away with it. The department, I mean, I think I got some sort of MA with some award, I forget what it was. They were very impressed by the thesis anyway. By that time, of course, I was using a computer and I was also using cassette tapes. So that's the difference. When I did the interview with Wendy and Jill, and also with Bill Jennings, of course, I was using the big clunky tape recorder with reel-to-reel tapes. I was using cassettes in the 80s with the Communist Party people. That collection of interviews with Communist Party people is now in the State Library of New South Wales, and I believe they have been transcribed and digitised. They're available to people publicly. There's a number of important issues which relate to the actual practice of oral history, and I'm sure you're familiar with these. One I'd like to talk about is permissions. Another one I'd like to talk about is transcription. Another one I'd like to talk about is technique and interview method. But let's start with permissions. At the time that I started doing my communist interviews, the very idea of having to seek permission of some kind to conduct the interview and to use the material from the interview was completely foreign to me. It only became an issue for me, or I only became aware of it as an issue when one day I was interviewing Wendy Lowenstein's husband Werner and his friend Doug Horsburgh. I think it was at Doug Horsburgh's place somewhere down in South Melbourne. And we were halfway through the interview. I was mainly wanting to talk to them about Unity Singers, which was a sort of a left-wing singing group that was around in the early 50s, and they used to sing at peace festivals. And I think there's photos of them singing, being at the big peace festival in the early 50s that Menzies banned international visitors from attending. Festival of Peace and Friendship, I think. Communist front, really. Yeah. Anyway, so I was interviewing them about Unity Singers, and all of a sudden the door burst open and Wendy burst in, raced over to the table and said, "What's going on here?" "Hey, you're not doing an interview, are you?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Well, I hope you're doing it properly." "Oh, I don't think you are. Give me the tape." She grabbed the tape, and I've never seen it since. So I'm still recovering from that experience. She obviously had an idea of how one should go about doing oral history. And I'm sure one of the things she was referring to was the fact that I hadn't presented them with a permission form. That doesn't seem to have altered my practice, because I conducted 100 interviews with former communists and I didn't get written permission of any kind. I didn't use a permission form. Okay. This later became more than just a problem. It became a nightmare, because when I decided I wanted to hand them over, the tapes over to the State Library of New South Wales, the library wanted me to provide permissions, of course.
Yep.
Well, first of all, the first thing to do was to find out which people had died, and a significant number of them had actually died, which made things easier. Then I had to kind of trace back their addresses. Luckily, I had their addresses. I got a pro forma permission form and sent it out to them, and I got most of the replies back. So eventually, through what was mind-numbing tedium, I actually got permissions. But there's a lesson in that. Unfortunately, when I started my New Left interviews, I didn't give permission forms either. Even when I started doing the New Left interviews in 1991, there was no suggestion in the Melbourne University History Department that that was what I should do. And I felt aggrieved, still feel aggrieved, that I was allowed to do that project. And I'm now faced with the problem, again, another nightmare, that I've digitised all the New Left interviews. They're all digitised. I have them here on the computer, backed up. And I'll probably have to go through the whole process again of recontacting all those people in order to have them accepted and made available to the public. The reason I'm holding on to them for the time being is that I want to actually use them in my research. So that's what I'm doing. But that's one issue that all practitioners of oral history should be very aware of. But I'm telling you, there was no, not like today, if you're doing any sort of interview in a university, even sociology department, you probably have to provide some form to meet their ethical requirements.
That's right.
But if I get in my own defence, let me just illustrate. And here I'm on the same ground with Marty Lowenstein, who also has had this experience with permissions, and she rails against the whole philosophy behind seeking permissions. I tend to be sympathetic to her view. I'll tell you one reason why. Even after I realised that I probably should be handing out a permission form, I realised that in some cases it was putting off the interviewee. You go to see an 85 or a 90-year-old person, let's just say for the sake of the argument, a bloke, a 90-year-old bloke, and you start off, you hand him the permission form with all this legalistic jargon in it. And I found that in one or two cases, this gave them the heebie-jeebies, which kind of made them think, oh, Jesus, what am I getting into here, So that was one reason. The other reason, because I was not a rich person, I was relying on grants from, or my, scholarship money from the uni. And if I did make an interstate trip to record, I didn't want to just record Victorians. I wanted to record, I'm talking about the communists. I didn't want to just do Victorians. I wanted to get the whole lot, New South Wales, Queensland, South Australia. As I did with the New Left, I travelled to every state. But because I had limited finances, if I did go to Brisbane to do interviews, I'd probably only be up there for a week. And I'd finish up doing about, in a week, probably 20 interviews. Mm-hmm. Now that's a hard slog. That's a lot of running around and using up money with taxi fares, because there's no way I could use the public transport system. I didn't have a car. I wouldn't have been able to get around on public transport because I wasn't familiar with the terrain, with the streets, with the geography. So you hop in a taxi and say, I want to go to so-and-so, suburb, street. So you'd land on someone's doorstep and you'd have an hour and a half. You'd walk in, you'd try to be as friendly and, get them at ease. But you do the interview and then you virtually have to leave straight away to go on to the next interview. There was very little time to talk about the ethics, the permission issue. I can remember I went in a taxi from Newcastle up to a place called Saltash in New South Wales. It cost me about $100 in the taxi, or more, I think, to capture one of the living legends of Australian communism, the guy who's since been found out to have been a Russian spy at the time, Wally Clayton.
Yeah.
I visited Wally Clayton, and this was one of my great moments in oral history, that I actually was in the lounge room with a Russian spy doing a recording with him. He actually wasn't Russian, he was Australian, he was actually born in New Zealand. But anyway, so did an hour with Wally Clayton. But because I didn't then know that he had been working for Moscow and sending off, being involved in espionage, sending off Australian state secrets to Moscow, I just recorded him about the underground in 1941-42 when the Communist Party was illegal, because he ran the newspaper. He ran Tribune underground, literally underground. It was under the streets of Sydney, literally.
Yeah.
So,
You're talking about permissions.
Yeah, well, I just didn't have time to talk to him about permissions. I had limited time. He probably would have turned his nose up at it anyway, or he would have said, oh, look, do I have to do that? You're only interested in my memories. There's nothing to worry about. What do you want a permission form for? What's all this all about? So you get involved with all this legalistic stuff. So I just found, I suppose it was opportunistic of me not to do it. It was taking the easy way out. And I'm fully aware of that, but it landed me in trouble later on. The other things were interview method. It was one, and
transcription.
Transcription.
Yeah.
I haven't been able to transcribe my interviews to any extent. I've done one or two, like I did a transcription of part of the Doug Kersner interview for the sake of that article I wrote, which I sent to you, which is due to be published in Record. It was supposed to be, but she was running out of space, so she knocked me back for this issue. But I haven't been able to solve this issue, and I don't know whether you've got any technical means at your disposal for transcribing. But although the other side of this is that I agree with you. You said something to me recently, I think, about the importance of the actual voice and the characteristics of the individual voice as a record of the person for a start, but it also, the way that a person speaks conveys a lot about their personality. It conveys a lot about the actual subject that they're describing. For example, in my cycling interview, I was interviewing a bloke called Peter Anthony about the Sun Tour of Victoria in 1956. And he was, it blew my mind. He said, I was up the front. He said, this is the first day of the race. We were riding from Geelong down to Lorne. And the person that everyone expected would win the race was Russell Mockridge. And Mockridge was down the back chatting away to Sid Patterson in the back of the field, or the peloton as they would describe it these days. They didn't use the term peloton in those days. That was a French invention, French import. But he said, I was up the front, and someone turned around and they could see that Mockridge didn't have his mind on the job, on the race. He was just chatting away, probably naive, but short-sighted as he was with glasses. Didn't realise that he had to be aware of every single moment. Someone said, go for it, go for it. And he actually said it in that way, go for it, now, go for it. We've got him. And they broke away, the lead bunch broke away, and Mockridge finished 5 minutes down at the end of that stage and never made it up throughout the rest of the race, which was 9 days. He lost it in the first quarter of an hour of the race over 9 days. And it was the brilliance of that memory, which was so detailed. And just not only the detail, but the way he relived it. He relived it. And I think that's something about oral history. You can actually almost touch the detail when someone describes something in such a way. It gives you a visionary aspect, a visual aspect. You know what I'm trying to say?
It's a way of experiencing history for people who weren't there. And that's a very good example, I think. But in a transcript, you would simply have the words, get ahead, or whatever it was.
Yeah, go for it. Go for
it with an exclamation mark. No transcript, no matter how brilliant the transcriber, can capture the inflections, the accent, and most importantly, which you'd appreciate as a musician, the pauses in between the sound. All that is part of the way we can experience history through the actual voice.
And I've had experiences where people have been very careful not to be derogatory or defamatory, but they can still tell by the tone of their voice that they may in fact be sneering when they mention someone. They might say, oh yeah, or and you can you can tell that they're actually being negative, although their words are not defamatory or derogatory. You know what I'm trying to say?
Well, a transcriber, there's no way a transcriber can capture sarcasm.
Exactly. That's very good.
Unless you put in brackets sarcasm, but that's a totally, that removes the humanity of it. So we're talking about my final question now, the point, about how important is the sound archiving and the quality of the sound reproduction, which leads me to want to ask you, I will get back to your other points, Ken, but I'm wondering, like you've mentioned, you've used reel-to-reel tape early on and you've used cassette recordings. Have you ever recorded straight to digital recording?
Yeah, I have. I've started using the digital recorder for interviews when I realised that. See, in my cycling project, I was using a digital recorder. I first came across a digital recorder in the year 2010. So when I did my first cycling interview in February 2011, I used the digital recorder. And then I was frustrated in that there were several people in other states that I wanted to interview. I didn't think that I'd ever be able to and then I suddenly realised, ring them up on the telephone, put the handset portable, phone on speakerphone, and the sound comes through, and you put the digital recorder beside the handset, and you can record their sound. Now it's not great quality sound. It's a bit not distorted. It's actually a reduced quality of sound, but you can get all the words. You can hear them quite clearly. And I finished up doing about a dozen cycling interviews, and I've continued on doing sort of new left or 60s interviews, 60s left interviews, using the same technique with people like people interstate or people in Melbourne that I might not have been able to get hold of any other way. So yes, the digital recorder has been a wonderful asset. And of course, again, with the digital recorder, you can just load everything off onto upload everything onto the computer and store it away.
Yep. What about preparation and selection of interviewees? Like, how do you select somebody, like say for your new left interviews, and how do you prepare then for an interview with them?
Good question. Because you probably should never start an interview with anyone before you've actually researched their area of experience. Because if you haven't gathered together a certain amount of documented evidence or information about what they were involved in, you're not going to be able to tell whether they're making it up to a certain extent or not. When I say making it up, that's probably a bad term. They're not necessarily even, they're not trying to make it up. But there is that possibility their memory might be inaccurate or lapsed or in some way. I mean, often people will I make mistakes about certain events.
Of course.
I'll get the month wrong, or usually not the year wrong, but I might get the month wrong. And someone will pull me up and say, "Oh, but I think you're wrong about that. I think it was February, not March." But doing the interview, you need to be able to prompt, lead, encourage at certain points. My technique generally in all the interviews I've ever done was simply to chat, because I for a whole number of reasons, I didn't think it was right or advantageous to fire off questions which were pre-prepared, because that forces the interviewee into a straitjacket which you have prepared for him or her, in that you don't have any right to impose a straitjacket until you actually learn about them and what they did and what their personality is, and you know what I mean? I mean, if you already have assumed the questions before you record them, then you're restricting their memory to what you want to hear, not what they want to say. You follow me?
I do, but to me, that's always been an issue with oral history, that, people like Paul Thompson talk about it's giving history to the people in their own words. But I've always been sceptical about that, because none of us are going to sit down and just say, well, tell me what you want to tell me. we will always, we as historian interviewers, we call the tune in the sense that we're approaching people because we want a topic, we want understanding. So whether it's a straitjacket or a broad question guide just to create some structure, it is definitely not a case of letting the people have their say in their own words, because the next step for us after the interview is that often we want to use some of the interview in an article or a book, and we select what part of their words we are using. It's an interaction, I guess, in that sense.
Look, you're totally correct, and I agree with you. I was putting a view there which was at one extreme. I don't want to put a straitjacket on the interviewee, but I need to feel that I'm in some sort of control of the direction of the interview. Otherwise, it'll just go off onto whatever the interviewee wants to talk about, which isn't necessarily what I want to talk about. But I do, however, my approach is to try to develop a chronological narrative or record, because I find the best way of jogging the memory is through association chronologically. Like if someone remembers something that happened in February 1982, they're more likely to remember what happened in March 1982 if you've already got to February 1982. And if you just bring up 1982 out of the blue and say, what did you do in 1982? They're thinking, oh Christ, whatever. But if you've already partly introduced or brought them into 1982, the association of one memory to another usually occurs. I found that happens in my case. So I always start by saying to someone, tell me about your younger days. What was your family background? Where did you go to school? Were you interested in politics when you were a teenager? Start them off on a chronological course and then just sort of chat. But balance the chatting style with a definite idea of where I want the interview to go and what I want to find out. I don't want them to stay too long on the 1 year or the one episode or the one experience. We've got to move it along. Every now and then you've got to say, well, look, thanks very much for that, but let's move on, sort of thing. Or pull them back. They've gone off on a tangent and you pull them back. Oh, you've got to remain in control. You're the one who's you're the one who's organised the interview. You have a right to feel that you should have control. But you've got to be careful not to make them feel as if they can't let their hair down a bit.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's a matter of how you approach it as an interviewer, isn't it? I think another benefit of that kind of structured approach where there's a guide or pointers before the interview, to me, it's always been important to give the interviewee the opportunity to think about what I'm going to ask. I've never thought of it like a psychological exercise where it's like, tell me, were you closer to your mother or father? And you expect them to, which is a question I ask. It can be a very telling question, but that's a type of question that somebody needs to think about before they answer it, and so that's why I like to send a broad question guide, making it very clear that it's totally negotiable and that it is simply a guide. But yeah, I think it's important for the interviewee to be able to sit back over a coffee, look at what you're going to ask and reflect on it deeply. That's the ideal.
Yes, that's probably something I've been a little bit neglectful of. Maybe I have done that a bit. I'm just trying to think. The other thing I should mention is my initial contact with the interviewee is usually done over the telephone, and that's where I have actually made sure that I've told them what I'm trying to do, what my purpose is, and what my methods are. And because the initial contact with the person, which is a personal contact, is very important in establishing trust and getting them to feel that they're in good hands. You're professional. You're not going to misuse their information or their memories. You can be trusted to use it properly. You must tell them what the purpose is. And so I think that's what I've done, generally speaking, that I've always introduced myself and my purpose and probably given them a pretty good idea of what to expect in the way of questions as well. but I haven't actually ever written it down as far as I can tell or remember.
Well, we all do it differently. We do it differently, and the main thing is the outcome, the result, which is the creation of a primary historical source where none previously existed. That's what we do. We create a historical source. And if we don't do it, then the person dies or gets crook, and everyone says, oh, why didn't we interview them, you know? But it's great. You've done so many. How many have you done, do you reckon?
I was thinking about this yesterday, probably around 300, maybe 320. I did 100 communists, 100 New Left, 90 cyclists,
wow,
20 odd footballs. It's about 320, I'd say.
Great.
Of course, the New Left stuff is still with me. It's not out there in the public, but eventually it will be. I'm not going to let it die.
Are you still recording interviews, Ken?
Yeah, I am. You're next on my list.